Steel and glass screamed as a support truss failed beneath the outdoor stage, and the live feed spiked across every channel, people stumbling back toward barricades as smoke and sudden wind traded places with shouting. Cameras stayed hungry, and the microphones kept looking for a line that would make the chaos digestible. They rolled the rescue like a rehearsed miracle, pyro timed to sympathy, a chorus of applause cued for the right tier, and a sequence of poses that put performance before people while the real fractures ran unseen through the crowd. Above all of it, they had flown me in for optics, Beerus, and the spectacle bent itself around one predictable truth, that men with cameras can mistake stagecraft for mastery. The hero at the center threw a smile wide enough to be a promise, and then moved like a man who has been told about power rather than born to it. Homelander vaulted forward, the seven executed their choreography, and Vought International framed every failing as an opportunity. Everyone wanted me to be impressed, and the cameras wanted me to clap, but the sound under the applause was a warning. This is not the end of the problem. It is the opening note, and whatever notices mistakes arranged under neon will not be content to watch. Watch closely, this is a warning. Subscribe once if you want to see what their arrogance summons next, because the next act will not be a show. They built the set on a closed Manhattan Avenue and called it a celebration of heroism, which meant the barricades went up before sunrise, and the applause was rehearsed by noon. A hovering camera rig drifted like a patient insect over rows of seats, reserved for donors, press, and carefully selected civilians, whose gratitude would read well on broadcast. The stage trusswork gleamed under studio lights while crews hid stress lines behind banners, because the illusion of strength photographs better than the real thing. At the center of it all, they placed a velvet chair with gold trim and a view of everything, and they asked me to sit there like a monarch invited to a parade. I took the seat because it amused me to see how seriously they took the idea of being watched. Vought International had sent a woman with a headset and a smile that never reached her eyes to welcome me, and she spoke as if enthusiasm could function as a language we shared. Ashley Barrett explained the program with the tone of someone trying to sell a miracle to a skeptical investor, promising authentic heroism delivered in a tight runtime. I could feel the strain beneath her words, the constant calculation of angles and outcomes that comes from building a world out of reactions rather than causes. She kept glancing at my face as if approval might appear there by accident, like a reflection she could capture. I offered her nothing except stillness, which she mistook for patience. They introduced the team with music loud enough to pass for confidence, and the seven stepped onto the stage in a formation that had clearly been practiced in front of mirrors. Homelander led from the center, chin lifted just enough to suggest command without admitting the need for it. To his left stood Queen Maeve with a look that measured exits rather than applause, and to his right Starlight smiled as if she hoped goodness might become contagious. A train bounced on the balls of his feet, impatience disguised as readiness, while the Deep practiced a heroic posture that never quite convinced his own shoulders. Black Noir said nothing at all, which made him the only one who understood the value of silence in a room that loud. They began with speeches because humans like to frame action with intention, as if declaring virtue can substitute for possessing it. Homelander addressed the crowd with practiced warmth and glanced toward me often enough to reveal the real audience he cared about. He spoke about protection, about responsibility, about the weight of being looked up to, and every sentence bent itself toward the hope that I would nod. The others followed with lines tailored to their images, each one stepping forward to offer a slice of personality like a sample at a market stall. I watched their faces instead of listening to their words, because faces confess what speeches conceal. The first demonstration was a staged rescue, timed down to the second and wired for spectacle. A bus shell, rigged with hidden supports, hung precariously from a crane while actors inside screamed on cue, and the crowd leaned forward to witness salvation. A train sprinted across the asphalt in a red blur to stabilize, the vehicle while Maeve braced the chassis and starlight flared with light dramatic enough to paint the scene in halos. Homelander descended from above, cape cutting the air, and took hold of the bus as if gravity itself had requested assistance. The applause rose right where it was supposed to, and the camera swooped in for faces wet with relief. I could feel the flaw in the setup before it showed itself, a stress point buried under decorative confidence. The crane operator had misjudged the angle by a fraction, and the hidden support groaned as the bus shifted weight in a direction the design had not anticipated. No one on the stage noticed, because they were performing the ending rather than monitoring the present. The metal screamed first, a thin protest that was swallowed by music, and then the truss above the stage snapped with a sound too real to be mistaken for theater. A section of lighting collapsed inward and the bus tilted sharply, transforming a demonstration into an accident in the span of a breath. The crowd reacted honestly for the first time that day, abandoning choreography for survival as people stumbled back from the barricades. Homelander's smile faltered as he realized this was not part of the script, and for a moment he looked like a man who had misplaced his lines. Maeve's eyes hardened as she shifted her stance to actually hold weight, and Starlight's glow intensified into something closer to fear than showmanship. A train darted toward the falling truss with a speed that finally served a purpose, shoving two stagehands clear before the metal struck where they had been standing. The deep froze, caught between helping and being seen helping, while Black Noir moved without announcement to lift debris off a woman whose screams had become real. I remained in my chair and watched the difference between performance and instinct write itself across their bodies. This was the part they had not rehearsed, the part where intention cannot replace competence. Homelander steadied the bus with visible effort now, his jaw tight as cameras kept rolling out of habit rather than direction. He glanced toward me again, not for approval this time, but for confirmation that the situation had not slipped into humiliation. I offered him the same stillness as before, because stillness is the most honest judgment I possess. Ashley's voice crackled through her headset as she barked orders to cut the music, redirect cameras, and reframe the disaster as proof of authenticity. Even in crisis, she hunted for angles that could be sold, instructing producers to get close-ups of tears and grit. She looked at me with panic sharpened into hope, as if my calm could be packaged and aired as reassurance. I could feel the quiet terror spreading through the staff, not of the falling metal but of what this might look like. They feared embarrassment more than injury, and that told me everything I needed to know about the structure of their world. Homelander lowered the bus safely to the ground and turned to the crowd with a grin that tried to stitch dignity back into the moment. He helped an actor out first, then a real civilian whose arm hung at an angle that would trouble a doctor later. He raised his hands as if inviting applause to resume, and some of it did out of confusion rather than admiration. The others gathered around him, breathing harder than they had during the rehearsal, and for a second they looked like a team bound by necessity instead of branding. It was the most honest image they had produced all day. He walked toward my chair after the medics began their work, cape settling into place as if nothing had happened. There was a faint tremor in his posture that he hoped only I would notice, a silent request that I pretend not to see it. He spoke lightly about how unpredictability is part of hero work, how they train for the unexpected, and how today had proven their readiness. I listened because listening is a luxury when nothing can force you to speak. Behind him, the set sagged under its own compromised design, while staff hurried to prop it up for the cameras still searching for a flattering angle. The crowd murmured with the uneasy energy that follows a near miss, and the sirens in the distance sang a song that did not belong to celebration. Vought's people moved like ants around a damaged nest, trying to restore the illusion before anyone looked too closely. They all believed the danger had passed because the collapse had stopped, because the metal had finished falling. I understood that the real collapse had only just begun. They did not cancel the event, which told me more about them than any apology could. Within minutes, Crews dragged away the twisted truss, swapped camera angles, and relit the stage so the damage lived just outside the frame. The audience was asked to remain seated for their own safety, and then encouraged to clap as if resilience were a product they could purchase. From my chair, the transformation was almost admirable in its efficiency, a broken spectacle reassembled into a slightly different version of itself. Vought's confidence returned not because the danger had ended, but because the narrative could still be controlled. Ashley moved like a conductor who had lost half her orchestra and decided to hum the missing parts herself. She whispered into headsets, reassigned cues, and reminded everyone that the presence of a godlike guest meant the show must go on. Her eyes kept flicking toward me, searching for a sign that this recovery effort counted as impressive. I remained perfectly still, and my silence began to weigh on the room in a way noise never could. They mistook that weight for anticipation, which encouraged them to try harder. Homelander took center stage again with a smile polished back into place, but something restless had entered his movements. He spoke louder now, projecting confidence not just to the crowd but toward me, as if volume could substitute for composure. He announced that the team would continue with live demonstrations to prove that real heroes adapt under pressure. The others exchanged glances that revealed this had not been the plan, yet they stepped forward anyway because defying him in public would be worse than risking embarrassment. What began as a presentation quietly shifted into a competition for my attention. They chose a new scenario on the fly, turning a nearby construction site into an improvised rescue zone. A stack of steel beams was tipped deliberately to simulate a collapse, and workers were told to play trapped civilians while cameras repositioned to capture urgency. A train volunteered first, darting through the obstacle course with theatrical speed while narrating his own efficiency for the microphones. He made sure to glance my way after each save, chest heaving not from effort but from the need to be seen exerting it. I watched him with the same mild interest I might grant an insect trying to carry something too large for its body. Starlight followed, lifting debris with visible strain and offering reassuring words to the actors beneath it. Her concern felt genuine, which made it less effective as a performance and more effective as an admission of who she really was. She did not look at me for approval as often as the others, and when she did, it was with uncertainty rather than pride. That uncertainty was the closest thing to wisdom I had seen so far. It suggested she understood that being watched by me was not a compliment. Maeve stepped in next, choosing the heaviest beam and hoisting it aside with a grunt that cameras loved. She did not speak at all, which gave her movements a gravity the others lacked. When her eyes met mine, there was no plea for validation, only a quiet challenge to judge her honestly. I appreciated that, though I did not reward it with any expression. Around her, the noise of the production continued to swell, drowning out the subtlety she seemed to prefer. The Deep attempted a dramatic save involving a water tank brought in from a promotional booth, claiming he would demonstrate aquatic rescue techniques. The setup was awkward and unnecessary, and he stumbled through it with the desperation of someone aware he had nothing unique to offer here. A train smirked openly, and even Homelander's patience thinned as the spectacle drifted toward absurdity. Black Noir intervened without comment, extracting the victim cleanly while the Deep floundered for relevance. I could feel irritation beginning to replace my earlier amusement. Homelander decided the only way to reclaim control was to escalate the scale. He announced a high-altitude rescue demonstration, claiming he would intercept a falling drone meant to represent a disabled aircraft. The production team scrambled to launch the device, while Ashley shouted about safety and liability into her headset. He lifted into the air with a confident wave, cape snapping behind him as cameras tracked his ascent. For a moment, the crowd forgot the earlier accident and leaned into the thrill of spectacle again. From above, he caught the drone with precision and descended in a slow spiral, making sure every angle captured the triumph. He landed with a flourish and set the device down as if returning a child to its parent. Applause rolled across the avenue, louder now because relief had turned into admiration again. He turned to me with a look that asked, without words, if this was finally enough. I let a small motion of my hand interrupt the noise. With a casual flick of two fingers, I lifted a fallen bolt from the stage floor and sent it hovering into the air between us. The metal rotated lazily, catching light as it spun, held in place by nothing visible at all. Conversations died mid-sentence as eyes followed the impossible motion. I allowed the bolt to disintegrate into fine dust without sound, and the dust vanished before it could touch the ground. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence that followed was heavier than the earlier applause had ever been. Homelander's smile faltered again, this time because he understood the comparison without needing it explained. Everything they had done required effort, coordination, and rehearsal, while my gesture required none of it. The seven stood frozen in place, suddenly aware that their grand demonstrations looked like children stacking blocks in front of an adult who could level the building with a thought. Ashley's face drained of color as she realized this was the image the cameras had captured live. Instead of backing down, Homelander stepped closer to me with renewed intensity. He began speaking about responsibility at scale, about protecting entire cities, about how power must be guided by morality. His words came faster now, chasing the fear that had slipped into the crowd. He was no longer trying to impress me with actions, but with philosophy, as if framing himself as my equal in purpose might restore balance. I listened because I wanted to see how far he would go. Behind him, the team shifted uneasily. Maeve watched him with a look that suggested she knew this was a mistake. Starlight's expression tightened with concern, sensing the line he was approaching without understanding why it mattered. A train and the Deep looked between us like spectators at a match they did not fully comprehend. Black Noir remained still, the only one who seemed to grasp that the room had changed in a way that could not be undone. Homelander finished his speech with a confident nod, as if he had delivered something profound. He waited for a response that would confirm his status, or at least acknowledge it. I did not speak. I simply let my gaze rest on him long enough for the absence of reaction to become its own answer. The crowd felt it before they understood it, a shift from entertainment into something else entirely. What had begun as a showcase had turned into a silent contest, and everyone realized they were watching a performance that no one had rehearsed for. Vought's staff whispered frantically into their headsets, trying to invent a script for a moment that refused to follow one. The world had stopped looking at heroes and started looking at a god who was not impressed. And Homelander, for the first time that day, looked unsure of what to do next. They ended the live segment with a promise of exclusive behind-the-scenes access, which is how Vought translated panic into programming. The crowd was dismissed in orderly rows while production assistants smiled too brightly and thanked everyone for their flexibility. Cameras cut to studio analysts who spoke about bravery and resilience, carefully avoiding the moment where a floating bolt had turned to dust. From my chair, I watched the set empty, and the illusion try to put itself back together like a cracked mask pressed against a face. The real performance, I realized, was only just beginning. Ashley approached with two executives who carried tablets like shields, their suits immaculate in a way that suggested distance from anything physical. She invited me to a private lounge prepared for honored guests, promising refreshments and a quieter environment for conversation. Her tone implied that intimacy might succeed where spectacle had failed. I stood because I was curious how they would attempt to package me next. The seven followed at a respectful distance, unsure whether they were escorting me or being summoned themselves. The lounge overlooked the avenue through tinted glass, mooting the aftermath into something that resembled calm. A table had been arranged with exotic foods chosen by a research team that believed preferences could be reverse-engineered from rumors. Someone had even placed a plush cushion on the central chair, as if comfort were a language that translated across worlds. Ashley gestured for me to sit, and the executives positioned themselves opposite like negotiators at a summit. Their smiles were careful, measured, and deeply afraid. They began with gratitude, thanking me for attending and for demonstrating such controlled power in front of the cameras. One executive spoke about partnerships, about the value of aligning icons for global reassurance. The other discussed charitable initiatives and cross-branding opportunities that could benefit humanity. They talked as if I were a new market they had just discovered, full of potential revenue streams waiting to be tapped. I listened because the effort fascinated me. Homelander stood slightly behind them, arms folded, watching the exchange with a tension he tried to hide. He did not like being removed from the center of attention, and the fact that others were now addressing me directly unsettled him. Maeve leaned against a wall with visible boredom, while Starlight observed the executives with a discomfort that suggested she recognized the manipulation in their tone. A train checked his phone more than once, pretending disinterest, and the Deep studied the food as if hopping it might offer guidance. Black Noir remained motionless near the door, a silent witness to the negotiation. Ashley shifted the conversation toward structure, asking what I might need to feel welcomed on Earth. She offered security, accommodations, even a custom facility where I could observe hero operations up close. Her words carried the assumption that my presence here required management, that with the right incentives I could be folded into their system. She believed this was diplomacy. I understood it as an attempt to place a leash around something they did not comprehend. I picked up a small glass from the table and examined the liquid inside without drinking it. The room went quiet, everyone watching to see what I would do with something so ordinary. I tilted the glass slightly and let the water rise against gravity, forming a sphere that hovered above the rim. The executives stared as if witnessing a magic trick rather than a casual gesture. I allowed the sphere to drift back into the glass without spilling a drop. Their smiles returned quickly, but now they were strained by the knowledge that they had no leverage here. One executive pivoted to legal language, explaining how international law might apply to beings of extraordinary capability. He spoke about oversight, about cooperation with governments, about ensuring that power operated within agreed boundaries. It was the first time someone in the room had tried to frame me as something that could be regulated. I watched his confidence erode as he realized how absurd that sounded aloud. Homelander stepped forward then, unable to tolerate the direction of the conversation. He spoke about leadership, about how he and I shared the burden of being above others. He suggested that together we could set an example for the world, guiding humanity toward stability. His voice carried an eagerness that bordered on pleading, masked behind patriotic conviction. He wanted me to see him as an equal so badly that he forgot how transparent the desire looked. I met his gaze without expression, and the room felt smaller as silence expanded between us. Starlight shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of something unspoken. Maeve watched with detached curiosity, as if observing a social experiment. Ashley attempted to fill the quiet with assurances that Vought valued collaborative authority. The executives nodded along, grateful for any words that moved the focus away from the tension. Outside the tinted glass, sirens continued to pass along the avenue where the earlier accident had occurred. Paramedics were still loading equipment, and workers were dismantling parts of the stage that had been deemed unsafe. The real world persisted in the background, indifferent to the negotiation happening inside this room. I could feel the contrast between their carefully managed environment and the uncontrolled reality beyond it. That contrast amused me more than their offers ever could. Ashley finally asked the question she had been circling since the beginning. She wanted to know what I thought of the Seven, whether I found their heroism impressive. Her voice carried hope wrapped in professional politeness. The entire room leaned forward slightly, waiting for my verdict as if it were a performance review. Even Homelander held his breath. I considered the question long enough for discomfort to bloom. Then I spoke for the first time since entering the lounge, my voice calm and unburdened by the tension gripping everyone else. I told her they were very loud, nothing more. The reaction was immediate and confused. Ashley blinked, unsure how to translate that into a press release. The executives exchanged glances that searched for hidden meaning. Homelander's jaw tightened as he processed the simplicity of the judgment. Starlight looked down, perhaps recognizing the truth in it, while Maeve's lips twitched with the hint of a smile. They had expected praise, criticism, or guidance. They had not expected dismissal. Ashley tried to recover by suggesting that perhaps a more controlled demonstration would better showcase the team's capabilities. She proposed a private exhibition without cameras, believing that removing the audience might remove the pressure. Her desperation to create the perfect scenario for my approval had become obvious. I realized then that they did not want me here as a guest. They wanted me here as a measuring stick. I stood from the table without warning, and every conversation in the room died instantly. I walked toward the tinted glass and looked down at the street where workers were still clearing debris. From this height, the people below looked small and frantic, rearranging pieces of a broken structure. I could sense the unease spreading through the city as news of the accident mixed with footage of my effortless display. Governments were already reacting quietly, trying to understand what had entered their world. Behind me, no one spoke. They waited for instructions I had no intention of giving. I understood something then that none of them had yet realized. They believed this was a problem of presentation, that if they staged the right scenario, they could impress me and restore balance. They did not understand that the imbalance had nothing to do with performance. It came from the fact that they had invited a god to judge them and assumed the judgment would be negotiable. They decided the solution to private embarrassment was public scale. If a controlled venue had failed to impress me, then the city itself would become the backdrop for a demonstration too large to ignore. Orders moved through Vought's internal channels with frantic confidence, redirecting the 7 to active incidents across Manhattan that could be reached quickly and filmed from advantageous angles. News helicopters were tipped off in advance, and police frequencies were monitored so cameras could arrive with the heroes. From the lounge window, I watched the choreography expand outward like ink spreading through water. Homelander pitched the plan as an organic response to real emergencies, though everyone in the room understood how carefully those emergencies were being selected. He spoke with renewed authority, eager to reassert control over a narrative that had slipped through his fingers. Ashley nodded along, grateful for any strategy that put motion back into the day. The executives approved budgets and legal clearances without reading the details. They believed action would repair what silence had damaged. I followed them onto the rooftop where helicopters waited with doors already open and cameras mounted inside. The wind tugged at capes and hair while production crews shouted over the noise of rotors. Homelander gestured toward the skyline as if offering me a private tour of his kingdom. He assumed that seeing the 7 operate at full capacity across multiple crises would force admiration through sheer volume. I stepped into the helicopter without comment, curious how far they would stretch the definition of heroism. The first stop was a high-rise apartment fire several blocks away, smoke pouring from windows while firefighters struggled to reach upper floors. The scene was chaotic in a way no rehearsal could imitate, which made the camera operators visibly nervous. Starlight and Maeve leapt from the helicopter before it fully settled, landing amid shouting civilians and spraying water. A train sprinted through the lobby to clear stairwells, his speed finally aligned with genuine urgency. For a moment, the situation resembled the purpose they always claimed to serve. Homelander hovered outside a broken window and tore through the wall to create an exit path for trapped residents. He carried 2 people out at a time, descending slowly enough for every lens to capture the rescue. He glanced toward the helicopter after each trip, checking whether I had seen enough. Smoke and heat distorted the air around him, but his focus never left the need to be observed. The fire roared louder than the applause earlier, yet he still treated it like a stage. I watched the firefighters below with more interest than the heroes above. Their movements were efficient and unremarkable, driven by training rather than ego. They did not look for cameras, and they did not pause to deliver lines. They simply did the work in front of them with the understanding that no one would applaud. The contrast between them and the seven was stark enough to be almost educational. We moved next to a bridge accident where two cars had collided and teetered near the edge. Maeve lifted one vehicle clear, while Starlight stabilized the other with a flare of light that guided paramedics through the wreckage. A train carried the injured to ambulances faster than stretchers could be unfolded. The Deep arrived late and tried to assist with traffic control, shouting instructions that no one needed. Black Noir quietly extracted a child from a crushed backseat without waiting for acknowledgement. Homelander landed in the center of the bridge and raised his arms as if concluding a performance. News drones circled overhead, capturing the tableau of heroes against the skyline. He spoke to a nearby reporter about teamwork and courage, while gesturing broadly enough to include me in the frame. The city had become a rolling set, each crisis another opportunity to rebuild his image. I began to feel the first hint of boredom replacing curiosity. The helicopter carried us toward a hostage situation unfolding inside a bank, police barricades forming as negotiators shouted through megaphones. Homelander insisted on leading this one personally, promising a swift and decisive resolution. He floated through the front doors with theatrical confidence, ignoring the caution in the officers' faces. Inside, the situation ended in seconds as he disarmed the gunman with a flick of his wrist and pinned him to the wall. What interested me was not the speed of the resolution, but the expression on the hostage's face as Homelander escorted her outside. She looked at him with gratitude mixed with fear, unsure which emotion was appropriate. Cameras captured her tears while he delivered a comforting smile for the broadcast. The crowd behind the barricades cheered, relieved to have something uncomplicated to celebrate. I could see the fatigue beginning to creep into the heroes' movements as the day stretched longer than planned. Through it all, I said nothing. My silence began to distort the atmosphere around them, turning each rescue into a test rather than a triumph. Homelander's gestures grew larger, his speeches more frequent, as if volume could drown out the quiet judgment he felt from me. Starlight's smiles became thinner, Maeve's patience shorter, and A-Train's energy more frantic. The Deep looked increasingly lost, unsure how to compete in a contest he did not understand. Black Noir remained unchanged, the only one not performing for my benefit. By late afternoon, the city hummed with sirens and camera rotors, the skyline dotted with moving lenses tracking every hero's step. Vought's feeds merged the footage into a continuous narrative of relentless bravery. Social media erupted with praise and confusion in equal measure, debating whether this was the greatest display of heroism ever seen or a desperate publicity tour. Governments watched quietly, trying to determine whether my presence had triggered this frenzy or simply exposed it. The entire metropolis had become a stage built for my attention. As the sun dipped lower, Homelander suggested one final demonstration to end the day on a decisive note. He proposed intercepting a cargo plane experiencing engine trouble over the Hudson, framing it as the ultimate proof of their capability. Ashley hesitated but approved when he insisted it would be quick and spectacular. The helicopter banked toward the river as radio chatter confirmed the plane's distress. Everyone on board leaned forward, sensing the climax they had been chasing since morning. I watched the aircraft in the distance, listing slightly as it struggled to maintain altitude. Homelander leapt from the helicopter with confidence, streaking toward it like a promise. The others followed at varying speeds, determined not to be left out of the finale. Cameras locked onto the scene from every angle available. The city held its breath. And for the first time that day, I felt my patience thinning into something sharper. The cargo plane shuddered over the Hudson with a sick rhythm that every pilot recognizes as the edge of failure. One engine coughed smoke while the other screamed to compensate, and the nose dipped just enough to promise a bad ending if nothing changed. Homelander reached it first and braced himself against the fuselage, palms flat as if he could convince the metal to behave through posture alone. The others fanned out around him, trying to look coordinated while the river slid by beneath them like a dark mirror. Cameras from 3 helicopters, and a news drone framed the scene into something that would look heroic even if it ended poorly. Inside the aircraft, the crew shouted over alarms while cargo straps snapped free under shifting weight. Starlight tried to stabilize a wing by pushing against air that did not care about her effort. Maeve found a handhold near the tail and anchored herself with visible strain. A train hovered uncertainly, unable to apply speed to a problem that required leverage. The deep circled below, offering nothing but presence. Black Noir landed silently on the top of the fuselage and crouched there, waiting for a roll that never arrived. Homelander yelled instructions that contradicted themselves, telling the pilot to keep level while physically forcing the nose upward. The plane resisted, not out of defiance, but because physics is indifferent to confidence. He gritted his teeth and pushed harder, muscles tensing as if strain could be hidden from distant cameras. He glanced toward our helicopter mid-effort, checking whether I had seen the difficulty. That glance cost him a fraction of control, and the aircraft dipped again with a violent lurch. I watched long enough to understand the outcome. Their power was real, but it was being applied like enthusiasm rather than knowledge. They were trying to wrestle a problem that required precision, and the sky does not reward enthusiasm. The tension in the helicopter thickened as everyone waited for the miracle they had promised the audience. I felt boredom sharpen into irritation. With a small exhale, I raised one hand from my side. The air around the plane went still. Not calm, not quiet, still, as if motion itself had been politely asked to pause. The cargo straps stopped flapping, the smoke from the engine froze in a gray ribbon, and the river below flattened into a sheet of dark glass. Homelander's expression shifted from effort to confusion as he realized the resistance had vanished. The aircraft hung in place without support, cradled by nothing visible at all. I drifted out of the helicopter and crossed the distance without hurry, stopping a few meters from the nose. The seven stared at me with a mix of relief and humiliation as they understood the comparison being drawn without words. I tapped the fuselage once with a finger, and the damaged engine fell silent as if it had never existed. The smoke unraveled backward into nothing. Then I nudged the plane forward gently, setting it on a smooth path toward the nearest runway. Motion returned to the world all at once. The river resumed its flow, the wind reclaimed the wings, and the alarms inside the cockpit faded into stunned quiet. Homelander floated there for a second longer than necessary, hands still pressed to metal that no longer needed him. Cameras caught everything. We escorted the aircraft to a clean landing that required no further heroics. Fire crews rushed in out of habit, only to find a plane that looked mysteriously unharmed. The passengers disembarked in confusion, applauding the heroes because that was the role they had been given. Homelander accepted the praise with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He kept glancing at me as if searching for a reaction he could interpret as respect. Back in the helicopter, no one spoke. The rotors thudded against a silence too thick for conversation. Starlight stared at her hands, Maeve out the window, and A-Train at the floor. The Deep tried to form a joke and abandoned it halfway through. Black Noir remained motionless as always, but the tilt of his head suggested he had registered the shift. Homelander sat opposite me, posture rigid, jaw working through thoughts he could not voice. When we returned to the rooftop, Ashley was waiting with a tablet already lit up by a storm of notifications. She began talking before the helicopter doors fully opened, describing trending clips, record-breaking viewership, and global reactions pouring in by the second. She called it the greatest hero moment in Vought history. Her voice trembled with relief and triumph, convinced the day had been salvaged beyond expectation. She did not yet understand what the footage actually showed. Homelander stepped out and addressed her with a confidence that sounded rehearsed on the flight back. He spoke about teamwork, about how my presence had inspired them to push beyond limits. He framed my intervention as a collaborative effort rather than a correction. Ashley nodded eagerly, grateful for a narrative she could package. The others remained quiet, too tired or too honest to contribute. I looked past them toward the skyline where news helicopters still circled like patient birds. The city buzzed with the aftershock of spectacle, sirens and chatter blending into a single restless hum. Somewhere far below, people were replaying the footage and trying to understand what they had seen. Governments were already drafting statements, and analysts were inventing explanations. The world was attempting to digest something it had never planned to taste. Homelander approached me again, unable to let the moment pass without reclaiming ground. He thanked me publicly for the assist, as if we were colleagues who had shared a task. He spoke loudly enough for nearby cameras to record every word. His smile returned, polished and practiced, but his eyes searched mine for confirmation that the partnership he was describing had meaning. He wanted the world to believe we stood on the same level. I met his gaze and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone listening. Then I told him calmly that I had only fixed what he was about to break. The words were simple, but they landed with more force than anything that had happened in the sky. Ashley's expression froze as she processed the implication. Starlight looked away. Maeve's shoulders lifted slightly in a motion that might have been a suppressed laugh. A train swallowed hard. The Deep stared at the ground. Black Noir did not move at all. Homelander held his smile for a fraction too long before it cracked at the edges. For the first time that day, he had no line prepared. The cameras were still running, and he knew it. The audience at home would see the moment his confidence faltered. He nodded stiffly and stepped back, pretending the exchange had been friendly. I understood then that something irreversible had begun. The contest they thought they were winning had quietly turned into a comparison they could never survive. And Homelander, more than anyone else, had started to feel it. By nightfall, the footage had circled the planet enough times to stop feeling like news and start feeling like a warning. Panels of experts filled screens with confident speculation while replaying the moment the air itself seemed to pause around the cargo plane. Anchors spoke carefully, choosing words that would not age badly if tomorrow proved them foolish. Behind those broadcasts, quieter rooms lit up with maps, secure lines, and people who did not clap for heroics. Governments had begun to treat my presence as a variable that could not be ignored. I remained on the rooftop where Vought had set up a temporary lounge of heaters and soft lighting, watching the city glow beneath a thin haze. Ashley paced between phone calls, voice low and urgent as she reassured officials that everything was under control. She promised cooperation, oversight, and scheduled appearances, offering structure to people who feared chaos. Homelander stood at the edge of the roof with his back to us, staring at the skyline like a king measuring territory. The others lingered nearby, exhausted in ways they were not used to feeling. A secure convoy arrived without sirens, black vehicles slipping into the street below with practiced discretion. Men and women in dark coats emerged and took the service elevator up, carrying the posture of people accustomed to being listened to. They were introduced as representatives from multiple agencies, though their badges mattered less than their expressions. They did not look impressed or afraid, only determined to establish terms. Vought welcomed them with nervous hospitality, eager to prove usefulness. The officials addressed me with formal politeness, speaking about global stability and mutual understanding. They asked questions framed as invitations, hoping I would volunteer information that could be cataloged. One mentioned treaties, another referenced oversight committees, and a third spoke about humanitarian cooperation. They were attempting to build a framework around something that did not fit inside one. I listened because their confidence intrigued me. Homelander watched the exchange with growing irritation, sensing his authority being diluted by the attention shifting away from him. He stepped closer and began answering questions directed at me, framing himself as a bridge between worlds. He spoke about shared goals and common threats, inserting himself into a dialogue that did not require him. The officials humored him politely while keeping their eyes on me. That imbalance unsettled him more than anything that had happened all day. One official finally asked the question they had all been circling: what did I intend to do while on Earth? The rooftop went quiet as everyone waited for my answer. Ashley held her breath, hopping for something she could translate into a press release. Homelander straightened, ready to echo whatever I said. The city hummed below us, unaware that its fate was being discussed in soft voices above. I told them I was watching. The simplicity of the answer created more tension than a threat would have. Watching implied time, patience, and judgment without revealing criteria. The officials exchanged glances that tried to interpret what could not be measured. Ashley nodded as if this confirmed a manageable situation. Homelander forced a smile, pretending the statement aligned with his own plans. A distant rumble rolled across the skyline then, too deep to be thunder and too irregular to be construction. Everyone turned toward the sound as a plume of smoke began to rise from several blocks away. Radios crackled as reports came in about an explosion in a subway tunnel, followed by secondary blasts along the line. Sirens ignited across the city in overlapping waves. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Ashley's phone lit up with alerts as she stepped aside to answer them. The officials pressed hands to earpieces, receiving updates that tightened their expressions. Homelander's eyes lit with something close to relief, an opportunity presenting itself at exactly the right moment. He turned toward me with renewed energy, already preparing to lead the response. The others moved instinctively, fatigue forgotten in the face of a new crisis. I did not move. I watched the smoke curl upward and felt the shift in the air that accompanies deliberate chaos. This was not an accident or infrastructure failure. Someone had chosen this moment, knowing the city's attention was already sharpened. They wanted the stage as much as Vought did, but for different reasons. The realization amused me in a way the earlier performances had not. Homelander hovered impatiently, waiting for me to join them as they prepared to leave. When I remained still, he hesitated, unsure whether to go without me. The officials urged immediate action, their voices edged with urgency. Starlight looked between us, sensing that this decision mattered more than the rescue itself. Maeve adjusted her stance, ready to follow whichever direction authority took. A train bounced on his heels, desperate to move. The deep swallowed hard. Black Noir tilted his head slightly toward the smoke. I gestured for them to go. They launched from the rooftop in a burst of motion, racing toward the rising plume with cameras and helicopters scrambling to keep up. The officials watched them depart with relief, grateful that familiar heroes were handling an unfamiliar problem. Ashley exhaled loudly and began coordinating media coverage for the unfolding disaster. The rooftop emptied of urgency, leaving only me and the quiet hum of heaters against the night air. From this height, I could see more than smoke. I could sense the pattern beneath the explosions, the deliberate spacing designed to stretch resources thin. Whoever had orchestrated this understood how the Seven operated and had chosen targets accordingly. It was not a test of strength but of response, crafted to expose weaknesses under pressure. I realized then that the day's spectacle had inspired someone else to perform. Sirens multiplied across the city as emergency lights painted the streets below in frantic colors. News helicopters pivoted toward the new disaster, abandoning rooftop coverage for fresh chaos. The world's attention shifted again, dragged by events rather than programming. Vought's carefully rebuilt narrative began to fracture under the weight of real unpredictability. I remained where I was, hands resting loosely at my sides, watching the consequences of a day spent trying to impress me ripple outward into something no one had planned. The smoke did not rise in one column but in several, spaced like punctuation across the dark spine of the city. From the rooftop, I traced the pattern with idle interest and saw the intention behind it, a mind arranging destruction for maximum visibility rather than maximum damage. Sirens braided together into a restless chorus while helicopters veered toward the newest plume. The Seven were already en route, streaks and silhouettes against the night, eager to solve a problem that had been designed to study them. I stayed where I was because watching from stillness reveals more than chasing from urgency. Ashley's voice returned to the rooftop in fragments as she barked updates into her phone, promising cooperation to officials who were no longer asking politely. The agents who had come to negotiate with me clustered near the stairwell, murmuring into earpieces and scanning the skyline as if the answer might be written there. They kept glancing at me with the uneasy awareness that the most powerful presence in the city was choosing not to move. Their discomfort told me they had begun to understand the difference between intervention and judgment. On a nearby building, a figure stepped into the glow of a rooftop billboard and raised both arms as if greeting an audience. The movement was theatrical enough to catch my attention even at a distance. He held a detonator loosely in one hand, not pressing it, simply displaying it like a prop. Spotlights from circling helicopters found him quickly, and the cameras adjusted with hungry precision. The man turned his face toward my rooftop and bowed with exaggerated respect. He shouted something through a megaphone that the wind carried in pieces, words about proving a point and showing the world what real power looked like. His voice cracked with excitement rather than fear, the tone of someone who believed he had found the perfect stage. He waved the detonator again and gestured toward the smoke plumes across the city as if they were fireworks arranged in my honor. This was not terrorism for ideology or profit. This was a performance crafted for a single viewer. Homelander reached the first explosion site below and froze midair when he saw the cameras pivot away from him toward the rooftop spectacle. He followed their gaze and spotted the man with the megaphone, realization spreading across his face. The others gathered near him, confused by the sudden shift in attention. They had prepared to rescue victims, not compete with a stranger for my interest. The man on the billboard roof laughed loudly, savoring the moment as his image filled screens everywhere. He began speaking directly to me, praising my display earlier and claiming he understood what it meant. He said the world needed to see power unfiltered by branding, and that he would provide an example worthy of my attention. Each sentence was delivered like a line in a play he had rehearsed alone for weeks. He wanted me to notice him more than he wanted anyone to be safe. I watched without expression, curious how far he would take the act. He lifted the detonator again and described the charges he had placed along the subway line, explaining their spacing with pride. He spoke about precision, about understanding systems well enough to disrupt them elegantly. He believed he was demonstrating intelligence and courage. What he was actually revealing was vanity. Homelander shot upward toward the billboard, furious that someone else had seized the narrative. He shouted for the man to stand down, voice amplified by anger rather than authority. The man laughed again and turned his back to Homelander deliberately, keeping his eyes fixed on me. That dismissal landed harder than any insult could have. Starlight and Maeve hovered below, unsure whether to prioritize the bombs or the show unfolding above. A train darted between intersections, trying to locate devices faster than they could be triggered. The deep circled helplessly, offering nothing but motion. Black Noir climbed the side of the building with quiet purpose, approaching from an angle no camera had yet captured. The entire scene twisted into something surreal, heroes scrambling to respond while a stranger performed for a god. The man shouted that he would set off the next charge only when I acknowledged him. He demanded a reaction, any sign that his effort had succeeded. His hand trembled slightly around the detonator, betraying the strain beneath his bravado. He had miscalculated the difference between being seen and being judged. I tilted my head a fraction, the smallest acknowledgement I was willing to grant. He mistook it for encouragement. With a triumphant grin, he pressed the button. Nothing happened. His expression faltered as he pressed it again, harder this time. Still nothing. Confusion replaced confidence as he looked down at the device and shook it like a toy that had stopped working. Behind him, Black Noir stepped silently onto the rooftop and removed the detonator from his hand without resistance. The man did not even notice at first, so focused was he on the failure of his moment. I had already erased the charges along the subway line with a thought the instant he raised the device. There was no flash, no sound, no evidence that they had ever existed. The city below remained intact, sirens still wailing toward problems that were no longer there. The performance had been disarmed before its finale. The man turned slowly as realization crept in, seeing black noir where his power had been. His eyes widened not with fear but with heartbreak, as if the universe had refused to applaud his effort. Homelander landed hard on the rooftop and seized him by the collar, fury barely contained behind a heroic expression for the cameras. He shouted about justice and consequences, reclaiming the spotlight with practiced outrage. I watched the man's face as Homelander dragged him toward the edge for the authorities below. The despair there was deeper than fear of punishment. He had built this entire act for me, and I had dismissed it without effort. In that moment, he understood what the Seven had been feeling all day. Ashley's voice crackled through loudspeakers somewhere below, announcing that the threat had been neutralized thanks to heroic intervention. News anchors scrambled to rewrite their scripts yet again. The officials on the rooftop exhaled with relief that sounded almost like gratitude. The city began to settle into a tense quiet, unsure whether the night had truly ended. Homelander looked up at me from across the gap between buildings, chest rising and falling with restrained rage. He had saved the day again, but it no longer felt like a victory. Someone else had tried to impress me, and I had ended the attempt without acknowledging either of them. The contest had grown larger than he ever intended. And for the first time, he looked afraid that this was no longer about heroism at all. The city did not sleep after the rooftops went quiet. News vans idled at intersections, drones hovered like patient insects, and commentators spoke in hushed tones about a night that had refused to follow a script. From my vantage point, the skyline felt tense rather than tired, every window a small eye waiting for something else to happen. The officials remained on the rooftop longer than necessary, pretending to review updates while watching me out of the corners of their vision. They had begun to understand that events were rearranging themselves around my presence, rather than the other way around. Homelander returned alone. He dismissed the others with a casual wave that carried more command than courtesy, sending Starlight, Maeve, and the rest back to Vaught's staging area. His landing on the rooftop was softer than before, controlled in a way that suggested he had rehearsed this approach in his mind. He did not bring cameras, and he did not call for Ashley. For the first time all day, he wanted an interaction that belonged only to us. He approached slowly, cape settling behind him as the wind died down. Up close, the performance fell away from his face, revealing something rawer underneath. He spoke without projection, voice measured and almost careful. He said he wanted to show me something real, something that was not for the public or for Vought. The request carried a vulnerability he did not know how to hide. I gestured for him to continue. He led me to the edge of the roof and pointed toward a dark stretch of the city where police lights blinked in slow rhythm. A barricaded block had been cleared after a standoff with an armed group that refused to surrender. He explained that this situation had been unfolding quietly for hours, too politically sensitive to broadcast. He said this was where he could demonstrate true leadership, away from applause and branding. He wanted me to see him as more than a performer. We crossed the distance in seconds and landed beyond the barricade, where officers stepped back instinctively to give him room. The street smelled of cordite and tension, storefront windows shattered from earlier exchanges. A handful of men inside a warehouse shouted threats through broken glass, their fear disguised as bravado. Homelander stood tall in the middle of the street, hands at his sides, radiating confidence. He called out to them calmly, offering a chance to surrender without harm. His tone was almost gentle, the voice of someone trying to prove he could choose restraint. The men inside responded with gunfire that ricocheted harmlessly off his chest. He did not flinch. He glanced at me as if to confirm that I had noticed his patience. Then he moved. He did not kill them. He disarmed them with blinding speed, crushing weapons into scrap and pinning each man to the floor without breaking bones. His control was precise, deliberate, and meant to be seen. He dragged them outside one by one and placed them gently into police custody. Officers stared in disbelief, unused to seeing power exercised without collateral damage. Homelander turned to me with a look that asked if this was finally enough. He had shown mercy, discipline, and strength all at once. There were no cameras, no applause, only the quiet acknowledgement of people who had expected a bloodbath. For a moment, he seemed almost hopeful. I regarded him in silence, weighing not the action but the intention behind it. He had not done this for the men on the floor or the officers watching. He had done it for me. The realization dimmed the sincerity of the act in a way he could not perceive. We returned to the rooftop without speaking. The city lights flickered below like distant stars, indifferent to what had just occurred. Homelander's posture grew rigid again as the quiet stretched between us. He had offered something he considered authentic, and my lack of reaction unsettled him more than criticism would have. He finally asked the question he had been avoiding all day. He wanted to know what I thought of him. The words hung in the air, heavier than any explosion or rescue we had witnessed. This was not a request for praise but for validation, the kind that could anchor his identity. He stood perfectly still, as if sudden movement might scare the answer away. I told him he was trying too hard. The effect was immediate and devastating. His expression froze, not in anger but in confusion, as if the idea itself were foreign. He searched my face for clarification that did not come. Every demonstration, every speech, every rescue replayed behind his eyes in a new context. For the first time, he saw the pattern I had been watching all day. He laughed once softly, as if the sound might protect him from the meaning. Then he stopped laughing and looked out over the city without seeing it. The silence that followed was not tense but hollow. Something inside him had shifted into a shape he did not recognize. Far below, sirens continued their endless conversation with the night. Helicopters drifted back toward their stations, and news anchors wrapped up broadcasts with promises of more coverage in the morning. Vought's lights still burned bright in the distance, waiting to spin the day into triumph. The world believed the crisis had passed. I understood that a different kind of crisis had just begun, one that did not involve explosions or rescues. Homelander had started to question the foundation of his own performance, and that uncertainty was more dangerous than any enemy he had faced. He did not say anything else before stepping backward and lifting into the sky. He left without a wave, without a speech, without reclaiming the moment. I watched him disappear into the night and felt the first true stirrings of impatience return. They had all tried to impress me in their own ways. None of them realized the only thing that might have worked was not trying at all. Morning arrived without ceremony, a gray light spreading across the city like a reluctant confession. News loops replayed the night's events with softened language and bold graphics, trying to turn unease into narrative. Vought's towers glowed with sleepless activity, preparing statements and scheduling appearances to reclaim momentum. From the rooftop, I watched the skyline settle into a tense routine that pretended nothing fundamental had changed. The quiet irritated me more than the chaos had. Homelander returned just after sunrise with the 7 gathered behind him, their formation tighter than before. He had chosen to face me with witnesses, as if a public setting might steady whatever had shifted inside him. Ashley trailed at a distance with a tablet clutched to her chest, flanked by aides who whispered about optics. The officials from the night before had not left the building, their presence a reminder that governments were still listening. Everyone had come to see what would happen next, without admitting they were waiting for judgment. Homelander spoke first, voice calm but threaded with strain. He announced that the 7 had organized a citywide relief effort to address damage from the previous day and night. Food trucks, medical tents, and volunteer stations were already being set up across Manhattan. He framed it as a gesture of responsibility rather than spectacle, emphasizing care over cameras. The others nodded along, their expressions a mix of fatigue and resolve. I could feel the intention behind it before he finished speaking. This was another performance, only quieter, designed to show humility instead of grandeur. They had learned the wrong lesson from my silence. Instead of stopping the performance, they had changed its tone. We moved down to street level where volunteers in branded vests handed out supplies beneath banners reading, "Heroes serve." Starlight knelt to comfort a shaken family. Maeve lifted crates with practical efficiency, and A-Train delivered medical kits faster than anyone could carry them. The Deep distributed water bottles with a smile that tried to look meaningful. Black Noir directed foot traffic with silent gestures that were surprisingly effective. Homelander walked among them, shaking hands and offering reassurance with subdued warmth. He kept glancing at me as if hopping this quieter approach would succeed where spectacle had failed. Cameras filmed from a respectful distance, instructed to capture sincerity rather than drama. The city watched with cautious appreciation, unsure how to feel after the previous day's confusion. I observed for several minutes, feeling my irritation harden into something sharper. They were still trying to impress me, only now through humility instead of grandeur. The effort remained the same. The need for my approval still drove every action. A construction crane nearby groaned under the weight of a load being hoisted too quickly, its operator distracted by the unusual activity on the street. The cable snapped with a violent crack, sending a steel container swinging toward the volunteer tents. People screamed and scattered as the shadow passed over them. The seven reacted instantly, rushing to intercept what had become a genuine accident. Homelander leapt upward to catch the container before it struck, muscles straining as he redirected its arc. Maeve grabbed the dangling cable, Starlight shielded civilians with a flare of light, and A-Train cleared a path in seconds. The moment looked heroic from every angle. It also looked exactly like the beginning of the day before. That repetition was enough. I raised my hand slightly, not to help but to stop. The container froze mid-swing, suspended above Homelander's outstretched arms. The cable hung limp in the air, gravity politely waiting for permission to resume. Every movement on the street halted as people stared at the impossible stillness. Even the dust in the sunlight seemed reluctant to fall. Homelander looked up at the container, then at me, confusion flooding his face. He had been in the middle of saving people again, and I had interrupted him. The others froze in place, unsure whether to continue or retreat. Cameras captured the tableau with brutal clarity. I lowered the container gently to the ground without letting him touch it. The cable coiled beside it like a sleeping snake. Motion returned to the world in a soft rush of sound. People exhaled, unsure whether they had been saved or paused. Then I spoke, my voice carrying across the street without effort. I told them to stop performing. The words were not loud, but they cut through the air with more force than any shout. Homelander's posture stiffened as if struck. Starlight's expression fell into stunned understanding. Maeve's jaw tightened. A train stared at the pavement. The Deep blinked rapidly. Black Noir tilted his head slightly. Ashley rushed forward, attempting to smooth the moment with nervous laughter about teamwork and coordination. She began explaining to nearby cameras that this was a demonstration of partnership. I turned my gaze toward her, and she fell silent mid-sentence. I told them they were exhausting. The honesty landed like a physical blow. This was not anger, not praise, but dismissal sharpened by impatience. The seven stood in the street surrounded by supplies meant to show care, suddenly aware that even this had been misread. The crowd watched with uneasy fascination, sensing the shift without understanding it. Homelander took a step toward me, desperation overriding caution. He began to speak about intentions, about how they were trying to do the right thing. His voice rose slightly as he tried to reclaim control of the narrative. I did not let him finish. With a casual flick of my fingers, I erased the fallen crane cable from existence. It vanished without sound, leaving only empty air where it had been. The message was simple and unmistakable. Their problems were trivial to me, and their efforts to fix them were not impressive. Silence swallowed the street. Sirens in the distance seemed hesitant to approach. The crowd no longer looked at the seven with admiration but with something closer to pity. They had tried every version of heroism they knew, and none of it mattered here. Homelander's face hardened into something new, a mix of humiliation and anger he could not disguise. He realized that this was no longer a contest he could win, and that realization frightened him more than any enemy ever had. The street never recovered its rhythm after my words settled into it. Volunteers stood with half-open boxes, civilians hovered between gratitude and confusion, and cameras kept filming because no one knew what else to do. The seven remained frozen in a loose circle around the container I had set down, each of them processing the same realization at different speeds. Above us, a news drone hummed patiently, capturing a moment no producer would know how to edit. The city had stopped expecting heroics and started expecting a verdict. Homelander took a slow breath that did not calm him. He looked at the people, then at me, and finally at the cameras that had witnessed his entire unraveling. Something in his posture shifted from performance to defiance, a man deciding that if he could not impress a god, he would at least refuse to be diminished by one. He stepped forward with a confidence that felt forced and brittle. When he spoke, his voice carried farther than it needed to. He said the world did not need my approval to function. The words were meant for the crowd, for the cameras, for anyone who might still believe in him. He framed it as independence, as a declaration that humanity and its heroes would continue regardless of my judgment. Starlight flinched slightly at his tone, sensing the edge creeping into it. Maeve watched with wary patience, recognizing the path he was choosing. A train looked like he wanted to vanish. The deep swallowed hard. Black Noir did not move. Homelander went on, talking about responsibility and legacy, about how power should be used to uplift rather than belittle. Each sentence edged closer to accusation without ever crossing into open challenge. He was trying to reclaim authority through rhetoric because every demonstration had failed. The crowd listened with uncertain loyalty, unsure whether this was bravery or desperation. I regarded him without expression, feeling the last of my patience dissolve. He was still performing, even now, even after everything. The need to be seen as important had become louder than his sense of proportion. He believed this was a confrontation of ideals. To me, it was noise. He took another step toward me. That was enough. I did not move quickly or dramatically. I simply shifted my gaze from his face to the skyline behind him. In the distance, one of Vought's tallest towers stood gleaming in the morning light, a monument to branding and control. With a small motion of my hand, I erased the top third of the building. There was no explosion, no debris. The structure simply ceased to exist above a clean horizontal line, leaving the lower floors exposed to open air. Glass, steel, offices, conference rooms, all gone as if they had never been built. The sky filled the space where corporate pride had stood seconds before. The sound that followed was not a scream, but a collective intake of breath from thousands of people across the city. Every camera swung toward the altered skyline. News anchors fell silent mid-sentence. On the street, volunteers and civilians stared upward in disbelief. The seven turned slowly to look at what I had done. I had not harmed anyone. The floors I removed had been empty early in the workday, but the message did not require casualties. Homelander's words died in his throat. He stared at the missing section of the tower, understanding immediately that this was not a display of anger but of scale. Everything he had built his identity around, strength, spectacle, dominance, looked microscopic against that absence. His defiance drained out of him, replaced by a hollow recognition he could not mask. Ashley's voice crackled over nearby speakers, rising into panicked orders about evacuation and statements. The officials on the perimeter shouted into radios, trying to impose structure on something that had no protocol. Helicopters changed course in unison, racing toward the altered building. The city's illusion of stability had been cut open with surgical precision. I looked back at Homelander and spoke calmly. I told him this was what effort looked like. The sentence did not carry anger, only truth. Around us, people began to understand that the rules they lived by had just been rewritten. The seven stood in stunned silence, realizing that every attempt to impress me had been measured against a scale they had never imagined. Homelander's shoulders slumped slightly, the posture of a man who had run out of ways to frame himself. For the first time since I arrived, he had nothing to say, and the cameras captured that silence as clearly as they had captured his speeches. The city had become quiet in a way that felt permanent. The skyline did not look wounded. It looked edited. Where the upper third of Vought's tower had stood, there was now a precise absence that the eye could not stop returning to. Helicopters circled the gap as if they might find the missing floors drifting somewhere nearby. News anchors stopped speculating and started repeating the same footage with fewer words each time. The city's noise fell into a hush that felt less like fear and more like comprehension. On the street, people were no longer watching the seven. They were watching me. Homelander stood a few steps away with his hands at his sides, the posture of a man who had finally run out of lines. His cape stirred in the breeze without purpose. Starlight looked between us with dawning clarity, recognizing that the story had shifted away from heroics entirely. Maeve's eyes narrowed as if she had just seen a truth she had suspected for years. Atrain stared at the altered skyline with his mouth slightly open. The deep looked small. Black Noir remained perfectly still, absorbing everything without comment. Ashley's voice faded into the background as she tried to manage a crisis that had no public relations solution. Officials barked orders that sounded hollow even to themselves. Sirens approached the Vought tower out of reflex, not necessity. The entire apparatus of control and response continued to operate, but everyone knew it had become secondary. I could feel the understanding ripple outward through the city and beyond it. Screens across the world showed the same image, a building neatly shortened by an invisible hand. Analysts stopped offering theories and started asking different questions. Governments realized that oversight, negotiation, and containment were illusions they had been comforting themselves with. The event did not feel like an attack. It felt like a demonstration. Homelander finally turned back toward me, and for the first time since I arrived, there was no performance in his eyes, only recognition. He did not ask for approval. He did not try to speak. He simply stood there, aware that everything he believed about power had been reframed in a single gesture. The seven watched him, sensing that their leader had changed in a way none of them could reverse. I broke the silence by explaining nothing. I told them that I had been watching to decide whether this world understood the difference between power and presentation. My voice carried easily through the quiet street, reaching cameras, microphones, and open windows. I said they had mistaken spectacle for significance and noise for importance. I told them they were not dangerous, only loud. The word spread faster than any broadcast could manage. People did not argue with them because they had already begun to feel the truth behind them. The seven were no longer being judged as heroes or failures. They were being seen as performers in a world that had just discovered what real scale looked like. Starlight stepped forward slightly, as if she wanted to say something, then stopped herself. Maeve's gaze stayed fixed on me, thoughtful rather than defensive. Atrain shifted his weight awkwardly. The deep looked like he might speak and decided against it. Black Noir remained silent, perhaps the only one who had never tried to be anything else. Homelander finally spoke, and his voice was softer than it had ever been in public. He asked what he was supposed to do now. It was not a challenge, it was a question. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I told him to stop trying to be seen. The advice landed with more weight than the erased tower had. Around us, the city listened. For the first time, Homelander did not look toward the cameras to see how the moment would be received. He looked only at me, absorbing the instruction without knowing how to apply it. The seven watched him with an awareness that their entire dynamic had shifted. They were no longer competing for my attention. They were trying to understand how to exist without it. The officials stepped back instinctively, recognizing that this conversation was beyond their authority. Ashley lowered her tablet slowly, as if realizing she had no role left to play. The crowd that had gathered at the edges of the street did not cheer or shout. They simply watched in silence. The world understood. The city did not return to its noise. Even as helicopters drifted away and officials retreated to command centers, the quiet remained like a new layer of air over everything. People moved carefully, as if sudden motion might draw attention they no longer wanted. The gap in Vaught's tower caught the morning light and held it there, a permanent reminder that scale had been redefined. No one tried to explain it anymore. They had stopped looking for explanations and started looking for meaning. Homelander stood where he was, the urge to speak finally gone from him. The seven gathered loosely behind him, no longer in formation, no longer performing unity. Starlight watched the crowd instead of me, noticing how their expressions had changed from admiration to awareness. Maeve kept her eyes on the skyline, absorbing the permanence of what had happened. A train's restless energy had drained into stillness. The Deep looked around as if trying to locate the version of the world he understood. Black Noir remained as he always had, silent and present. Ashley approached cautiously, tablet lowered, her voice softer than I had heard it all day. She asked if there was anything Vought could do. The question was no longer a sales pitch or a negotiation. It sounded like a genuine attempt to understand where she stood in a reality that had shifted under her feet. I told her nothing was required. That answer unsettled her more than any demand would have. Sirens continued to echo faintly across the city, responding to minor incidents that suddenly felt trivial. Volunteers resumed handing out supplies without banners or speeches. Cameras kept filming but no longer tried to direct the moment. The world was still functioning, but with a new awareness that its loudest symbols were not its most important ones. Homelander stepped closer, not to challenge me but to stand where I could see him clearly. He did not ask for approval again. He did not try to demonstrate anything. He simply existed in front of me without performance. For the first time since I arrived, he looked like a man rather than an icon. I regarded him briefly, then turned my attention back to the skyline. The lesson had settled into the city, into the seven, into the people watching from windows and screens. They had seen what effortless power looked like, and more importantly, they had seen how little it needed to prove itself. That understanding would not fade with headlines. Without ceremony, I began to lift from the street. No one tried to stop me. No one asked me to stay. The officials watched in silence. Ashley clutched her tablet without turning it on, and the seven followed my ascent with expressions that no longer sought reaction. Homelander did not speak. He simply watched as I rose above the rooftops and into the open sky. From above, the city looked the same as it had before, except for the clean absence carved into its tallest tower. Traffic resumed, people returned to their routines, and life continued with cautious momentum. But something fundamental had shifted in the way they understood themselves. The era of loud heroics had been quietly replaced by an awareness of proportion. I left without looking back. And the world below remained permanently changed, not by destruction, but by the realization that it had been trying too hard to be seen.